Chapter 26 of Stories of Old Greece and Rome by Emilie Kipp Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26 Bellerophon. At the court of Proetus, king of Argos, there dwelt as guest of honor a young prince named Bellerophon. He was a kinsman of Proetus and a grandson of Sisyphus, king of Corinth, so much honor was shown him. As he was strong, brave, and fearless, he was a leader in all the games, and his beauty won such favor at the court that Proetus's wife, Queen Antaea, sought his love. Since the youth could not in loyalty return her affection, he found it difficult to remain in Argos, for the queen was not content to receive only the courtesy due her, but importuned Bellerophon for his love. He tried many times to find some pretext for leaving his kinsman, so when Proetus proposed that he should make a journey to Lycia to deliver some important messages to its ruler, the youth was eager to go. Meanwhile the queen, angered at his indifference, had told her husband that Bellerophon delighted in treating her with contempt in return for all her kindness, and that she could not endure his presence in Argos any longer. She demanded further that Proetus should put the young man at once to death, but that he should not let Bellerophon suspect that she had been the instigator of the deed. The king readily believed his wife's artfully contrived story, and declared that the insolent youth should be made to pay dearly for his ingratitude. As Bellerophon was already a hero at the court, Proetus dared not condemn him openly to death, so when the prince departed on his journey to Lycia, he carried with him some letters, whose purport he was far from suspecting, for the sealed message that he bore so light-heartedly was a request to King Iobates to put the bearer at once to death. King Iobates was the father-in-law of Proetus, and the ruler of Lycia had often relied on his powerful relative as an ally in time of war. So the king of Argos was confident that his instructions would be carried out. The expedition to Lycia might, therefore, have had a different ending had not Bellerophon forgotten to deliver his letters for several days. Meanwhile King Iobates, supposing him to be on a friendly visit, received him very hospitably and made him a member of the royal household. After much feasting and entertainment, the young prince suddenly remembered the sealed message entrusted to his care, and hastened to deliver it to Iobates with many apologies for his forgetfulness. When the king read the letter, he was surprised and horrified at its contents, for he could not in cold blood kill the guest who had sat at his table, and yet he did not wish to refuse any demand made by Proetus. When the courtiers saw his white face and troubled looks, they wondered what the message contained, but no one suspected its real import. At last a solution of the difficulty came to the king's mind, and he began to praise Bellerophon for the bravery and courage that had made the young prince famous throughout Greece. He lamented that no such fearlessness dwelt among the men of Lycia, for otherwise the Chimera would not be living in security and laying waste the king's lands. When Bellerophon heard what terror was inspired by the mere mention of the Chimera's name, he wondered whether he would be afraid to face this fearful creature with its lion's head, goat's body, and dragon's tail. When he expressed surprise that no hero had slain it, the wily Iobates at once implored him to help the stricken country and to go himself to fight the Chimera. Bellerophon might have been eager for this adventure had he not learned to love the king's daughter, Philonoe, who had found the handsome stranger more to her liking than all the youths of Lycia. He was therefore loath to leave the princess and depart on so perilous a venture, but at the repeated urging of Iobates he began to make preparations for the journey. Before setting out he first consulted the soothsayer Polyidus, who advised him to procure the winged horse Pegasus, if he hoped to succeed in slaying the Chimera. This advice was probably well meant, but it was very discouraging, for how could Bellerophon expect to bridle the famous immortal steed that had never known the touch of any man's hand? He knew too well that Pegasus was rarely seen by mortal eyes, for he dwelt on the calm heights of Mount Helicon, a spot sacred to the Muses, and seldom came to earth except to visit the fountain of Pyrene near Corinth, whose clear waters sometimes tempted him to leave his lofty home. Very few people had ever seen the snow-white horse with his wonderful silvery wings that carried him through the air as buoyantly as an eagle in its flight. Whenever Pegasus deigned to come to earth to taste the sweet waters of Pyrene, he sped over the grassy meadows so swiftly that even the fleetest runner could not hope to catch him. He had never been bridled in all his wild, free life, and for beauty and strength and sheer joy of living there was nothing like him in the whole wide world. Sleeping at night as he did on a lofty mountain top, and passing the greater part of the day in the air, Pegasus seemed hardly to be a creature of the earth. Whenever he was seen, up very high above people's heads, with the sunshine on his silvery wings, one would have thought that he belonged to the sky, and that, skimming a little too low, he had got astray among our mists and vapors, and was seeking his way back again. In the summer time, and in the beautifulest of weather, Pegasus often alighted on the solid earth, and, closing his silvery wings, would gallop over hill and dale for pastime as fleetly as the wind. When Bellerophon was advised to catch this glorious winged steed, it was no wonder that he felt discouraged, for nowhere could he find an old man, a maiden, or a child who had ever had so much as a glimpse of the snow-white Pegasus. Some one told him, however, that the immortal steed had once been tamed by Minerva, and owed obedience to her, so he went immediately to the temple of the warrior goddess, and begged her to help him. For many hours he prayed before Minerva's shrine, but there came no answer to his petition, and at last, worn out with fatigue and discouragement, he fell asleep on the steps of the temple. When the first rays from Apollo's golden sun car fell on the white marble pillars of the temple, Bellerophon awoke, and to his great astonishment he found in his hand a golden bridle. Believing this to be the answer to his prayers, he set out hopefully on his search for the winged horse, and before journeying very far he came to the fountain of Pirene, where the beautiful clear stream bubbled up beside a grassy meadow so redolent of ripening clover that it might tempt a far more fastidious horse than the immortal Pegasus. Bellerophon spent many days beside the fountain, but he never caught a glimpse of the white-winged steed, nor saw any mark of his hoofs upon the sod. Once an old man stopped to ask him why he was lingering so long beside the fountain, and then shook his white head incredulously when Bellerophon spoke of Pegasus and his silvery wings. At last the young hero grew so discouraged that he decided to return to the court of Iobates, but on the very morning that he was intending to leave Pirene he chanced to wake just at dawn, and, leaning over the fountain to bathe his flushed face, he saw reflected in the water an image that made his heart beat fast with hope and joy. It seemed like a great white bird flying high up among the clouds, where the sunlight shone on its silvery wings. Nearer and nearer it came, sweeping the air in great wide circles, and at last it alighted beside the fountain. Bellerophon meantime had hidden himself in the bushes, and now he watched the beautiful creature as it folded its gorgeous wings and bent its arching neck to drink the clear water. Then Pegasus daintily cropped a few clover blossoms, shook his long white mane, and began to run up and down over the meadows, capering madly like a colt just set free in the pasture. After rolling luxuriously in the thick grass, and racing like the wind across the meadow, Pegasus grew tired of his play, and folding his snow-white wings, trotted quietly up to the fountain to take one more drink before flying back to his home on Mount Helicon. Then Bellerophon crept noiselessly out of his hiding-place, and while the unsuspicious Pegasus was drinking the cool water and his eyes were no longer watchful, the youth boldly sprang upon his back and took firm hold of the thick mane, being careful meantime not to let Minerva's golden bridle slip from his fingers. Bellerophon had ridden many a horse, but never one as wild and spirited as this, for the glorious Pegasus had not known until now the ignominy of bearing a mortal rider on his back, and he did not intend to submit to the disgrace. When he felt the touch of Bellerophon's knees on his broad flanks, he made a tremendous bound into the air, and before the youthful rider could realize what had happened, he found himself hundreds of feet above the earth. The winged horse snorted and shook with anger, and tried to unseat his rider by every trick known to equine ingenuity. He bounded forward with a sudden jerk, reared, turned over and over in the air, until half the time Bellerophon was riding with his head downward, but in spite of all his efforts he could not throw off the strange thing that clung to his back. All at once Bellerophon saw his chance to slip the golden bridle between the maddened horse's teeth, and suddenly Pegasus became as gentle and tractable as if he had always obeyed the will of a master. Happy to find the conflict over, the young hero turned the head of his white-winged steed toward the mountain region where the dread Chimera dwelt. It was a wild and rocky part of the country that Bellerophon looked down upon, and he saw all round him the evidence of ruin wrought by the fire breathing monster. The dwellings of the peasants were in smoking ashes, carcasses of half eaten cattle were strewn about the barren pastures, and human bodies were also to be seen, torn and mangled by the Chimera's ruthless claws. On the mountain side was a deep hole in the rocks, and from it issued clouds of black smoke that had a horrid, stifling smell as it rose up from the cavern's mouth. As Bellerophon descended nearer to the earth, the delicate nostrils of his horse dilated at the first contact with the foul smoke, and he found it hard to persuade Pegasus to fly closer to the Chimera's den. When they did approach through the thick cloud of smoke, Bellerophon saw the monster's great body stretched out at full length in the cave, while all the three heads lay on half-eaten carcasses that were strewn about the floor. The lion and the goat part of the Chimera were asleep, but the snake was wide awake, and when it saw Bellerophon approaching on his winged horse, it raised its head and began to hiss so loudly that it roused up the other creatures until they too were intent and watchful. Then the smoke poured out of the cave more thickly than before, and if Pegasus had not carried him quickly away from the poisonous fumes, Bellerophon would have been suffocated long before he was able to get near enough to deal the Chimera a mortal blow. But the brave horse bore him out of danger, and kept him far above the thick smoke until the monster crawled out of its lair. Then, like the swift rush of air, Bellerophon swooped down upon the Chimera and cut off its three horrid heads with his sword. But even then the danger was not over, for the headless creature sprang into the air and clutched wildly for its enemy with its long claws. So sure an instinct for destruction did the Chimera have, that, mangled and dying as it was, it struck directly at Bellerophon and would have torn him to pieces had not the faithful Pegasus borne him swiftly out of reach of the deadly claws. After a few vain attempts to grasp its destroyer, the Chimera's great body gave a convulsive shudder and fell back, stone dead, upon the blood-soaked ground. Then Bellerophon sped back to the court of Iobates and announced that the Chimera was dead. The king was glad to hear that the monster could no longer devastate his land, but he was sorry to see Bellerophon returning unhurt and victorious, and with such a wonderful prize as the winged horse Pegasus. Most people had never believed that this immortal steed really existed, and had thought that the stories about it were merely old wives' tales. Iobates did not dare to kill so popular a hero as the young prince became after this adventure, but he sent him off on other perilous journeys, hoping that on one of them he might meet his death. Bellerophon, however, never came to any harm, for he had always the sure help of Pegasus, and he returned safe from each expedition with trophies to lay at the feet of his beloved princess Philonoe. At length the king was convinced that Bellerophon was under the special protection of the gods, and hoping to win their favour, he gave the young hero his daughter in marriage, and appointed him his successor to the throne. For several years Bellerophon lived happily in Lycia, but his many victories with Pegasus made him presumptuous, and he felt that his true place was with the immortals. So one day he mounted his winged steed and flew far above the earth into the white clouds that wrap the top of Mount Olympus. Angered at this insolence and daring, Jupiter sent an enormous gadfly which stung Pegasus so cruelly that he gave a sudden leap forward, and this unexpected movement threw his too confident rider from his back. The luckless Bellerophon felt the reins slip through his fingers, and he plunged downward through the mist and clouds, many, many miles to the earth. This terrible fall would have killed any one but a mythological hero, but Bellerophon, though bruised and shaken, only lost his eyesight. Ever afterwards he wandered through the fair places of the earth, lame and blind and lonely, lamenting the foolish pride that had led him to risk the anger of the gods. What his end was no one ever knew, but he probably died in some distant land, alone and forgotten, while Pegasus went back to the sunny slopes of Mount Helicon, and never visited the earth again, even to drink the sweet waters of Pyrene. End of chapter 26.